Good evening, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of Mitchell's Childhood Memories. As you can tell from my first 2 episodes, as a little child growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, I was a very good-natured, sensitive, good-hearted, but I would say fragile young child. For me to get by and survive and prosper, my food was love. And I was very fortunate to be deeply loved by my parents, my mom and dad, and by 4 grandparents and 1 great grandmother. Yes, I was so lucky that I had them all for my childhood. In fact, 3 of my grandparents lived up until my middle age. So I was very, very blessed by God for having their presence. I think it's very important that if you want to know who a person is, you have to know where that person came from. And for me, I like to tell the story of my grandparents. First, my parents on my father's side, my grandpa Nathan and my grandma Rose, and you can see their pictures here. My grandpa Nathan was born in the small city of Makarov, Russia, which is now in the Ukraine. And he was from a very poor family. In fact, he was a slave. I mean, it's hard to imagine that, but he was an indentured servant. His family was large. He had numerous brothers and sisters, and the family simply couldn't support him. So he was given away to a wealthy family, and he worked, and he lived there. He worked all day, all night, not all night, but most of the day into the evening, hard labor. As a little child at 7 years old, he was sent away. And for that, he got a nice meal before he went to sleep and a place to sleep. And he lived that way from until his teenage years. So imagine what other children were going to school and playing with friends and having toys. No, my grandfather worked as a slave. But his story is amazing. His master was a machinist in Makarov, and he used my grandfather when he was a little boy to pump a bicycle to make electricity. Now remember, this is just after 1900. Electricity was just at its beginning stage. So to get a reliable supply of electricity, my grandfather was made to pump the bicycle over and over and over again in the factory to produce electricity as the machinist worked. But my grandfather was very clever. As he pumped, he observed his boss, he observed the machinist, everything he did. Sometimes he asked questions, sometimes he volunteered to help. And with that knowledge that he gained when he was a teenager, he left and he went out on his own seeking work as a machinist. And he did. He got work in Kiev, nearby Kiev, as a machinist, although he had to leave the city in the evening, or if he was caught as a Jewish man, if he was caught in Kiev, he could have been arrested and beaten up, etc. Just before World War I, when he knew he was going to be drafted into the army, he didn't want to die in some useless war, and so he made his daring escape over the border, and eventually made his way to America to build a better life. Now, my grandma Rose grew up in a small village, a farming village called Szpaki, in very eastern Poland, near the border of Belarus. And her father was a blacksmith, and she had quite a few brothers and sisters, most of them older than her. And it was, again, incredibly poor family. In fact, she didn't even have a bed to sleep on as a little girl. Sometimes they would pick 2 chairs together, and she would sleep on the 2 chairs, lie down in the 2 chairs. That was her bed. So imagine what she went through. And my grandfather, the great-grandfather, the blacksmith, he came to America first with one of his sons, Then when they earned enough money, they brought some more sons, more sons. But my grandma Rose was like the last to come, and her mother. Actually, I should say that my grandmother Rose lost her mother when she was 3 years old, and loved her mother so dearly. It was such a shock that actually she disappeared into the forest, calling out for her mother. She thought her mother was somewhere in the forest. She couldn't comprehend that her mother had died. Now, her father remarried, but unfortunately, this new mother, this stepmother, was very, very mean to my grandmother Rose. For some reason, maybe that she wasn't her own child, she like psychologically abused her and hurt her so every day so badly. And then with a father in America, not that there to protect her, her life was a living hell. And she would wander away from home. She even had the humiliation of having the stepmother cut off all her hair, made her bald to sell that hair to make a few pennies. My grandmother was just in tears every day, and she wandered out of her home, and there was a wonderful Polish woman, a Christian woman named Magda. And Magda became like a second mother, and gave her hope and said, "There's a future for you. You're a beautiful child. You can make it. You can do it. Hang on, hang in there." And she did. She eventually made it to America, and that's where she met and married Nathan, and they were the best of friends. She finally had a friend. Not only was Nathan her husband, but he was the best friend, and she could talk about all these things in her life. In 1922, my dad was born, Paul. He was their only son. And in 1948, I was born, being there. So I was the first grandson. And they just loved me so much. They gave me so much love and support. And it was something so special. As a little boy, I remember living, I would stay in their home sometimes. And actually, I even slept in the bed with them. They loved me so much. And we woke up in the morning, and my grandmother would squeeze me fresh orange juice, and she'd make me fresh porridge. And they treated me so magnificently. One thing that they really loved about me, they didn't have any toys. There was nothing for me to play with. So all they would give me was a bag of clothespins, and I would occupy myself for hours. I would take those clothespins and I would use it for arts and crafts. I would make designs with the clothespins. I would clip them together and make jewelry and make circles and squares and all different kinds of things. I spread them all over the sofas and the chairs. I got lost in these clothespins. And there were two types. There were the fat clothespins, the skinny clothespins. So a little boy, I made them army men. The big clothespins, fat ones against thin ones, and they had a war. And they thrilled over me. They thought that I was I didn't need materialism. And so they really, really loved me so much. And my grandpa Nathan died in 1964. It was a big shock to me. He was such a wonderful man. My grandmother Rose lived, approximately another 25 years. And I remember I was living in California at that time. I received a phone call from my mom and dad that my grandmother was in the hospital in New York and about to die. And I think she had gone into a coma. And my parents living in Florida then both had surgeries, and they were unable to come at that moment. So I flew to New York. I went to the hospital. At the reception, they told me, "Your grandmother is in coma. You'll never be able to speak to her. But you can go in for 5 minutes." So I go in, close the door, sit down on the chair. My grandma Rose, who's laying in bed, unconscious, she just jumps up. She sits up. She says, "Hello, Mitchella." That's what she called me, Mitchella. "Hello, Mitchella." And she started telling me again how wonderful I was, how beautiful I was, how she loved when I came over and she squeezed orange juice and made porridge, and how I played with the clothespins. And I didn't need, how unmaterialistic I was, that I didn't need any toys or anything special, how I could occupy myself just with clothespins. And then she stretched out, and that was the last time I ever spoke to her. But I just wanted to say, look, my grandfather Nathan coming as a slave, and my grandmother from such poverty, and what courage, what conviction, that strength that they had, and that strength and that love that they have is in my blood right now. Thank you very much, everyone.